And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr Cathy Kezelman, from Adult Survivors of Child Abuse. Cathy Kezelman is trained as a medical practitioner and practices as a GP for 20 years. She has been both the CEO and Executive Director of Adult Surviving Child Abuse, ASCA, and is now the Head of Stakeholder Relations of ASCA, a national organisation which advocates at a state and national level and working to meet the needs of more than 2 million Australian adults abused as children. That's pretty impressive for an organisation. She is a board member of the Mental Health Coordinating Council, which is the peak body representing community managed and non-government mental health organisations. In 2010, Cathy published her own memoir, Innocence Revisited, a tale in parts chronicling her own battle with depression and suicidal ideation, at the core of which was unresolved childhood trauma. And now I introduce Cathy.
Can I be seen? I think I'm see, I wore the heels. That's my advantage. So thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me here today. As you can see, I wear a number of hats. I'm a survivor, also a mental health consumer, and the child of 2 parents with mental illness. Also a medical practitioner by training, and on the board of the Mental Health Coordinating Council. My key role is with ASCA. I've been involved with ASCA for 10 years in a number of roles. And yes, we're a small organisation trying to do a great deal with a very large brief. There are more than 2 million adults in Australia who have suffered some form of childhood abuse, neglect, grown up in a situation of family violence, and that's an enormous number, and we think that's a conservative estimate. So by way of introduction, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal story, not because I think that I'm any different to other people who've experienced abuse, but that I think it helps to put the rest of what I want to say into perspective. And I suppose, having been a medical practitioner, one would have assumed that I would have known about trauma and the mental health impacts of trauma. But certainly when I had my breakdown, I didn't know what on earth was happening to me. And my experience was that my mental health professionals were probably, colleagues, were probably the least supportive of many, and they bolted the fastest. They couldn't cope with a member of their group having fallen off the perch. And that was very sobering, and I'm sure everyone's got stories to share. So obviously we have a great way to go in educating health professionals and workers. So I was a GP working away in Sydney. I'd been in the general practice for 20 years. And my niece, who I was very close to, died suddenly. She was killed in a car accident. And that started a process of me unravelling. I had no memory of anything having happened to me in childhood. So when Angela was killed, I started to grieve, as everyone would and does. But that grief didn't improve. It became more entrenched, and I started to develop panic attacks. I became very anxious, sank into a very deep depression. And at least I had the insight that I needed to leave work. I took a 4-month sabbatical. That was 13 years ago. And yes, I mean, I had no concept of what was happening to me. It was terrifying. I started to have flashbacks, and I don't know, I'm sure people here have experienced them, but being a middle-aged mother of 4 1 minute, and then a 4-year-old, 10-year-old child the next, thrown back into experiences for which I didn't have the words, because they were child memories and child fragments, so often didn't have a context, but in pain and in fear. So, you know, I thought I was losing my mind, and did see the help of seek the help of a psychologist, which for me was an enormous effort because I've been brought up to be fiercely independent, to think that vulnerability was to be denied, especially in myself. But thank goodness I did go and see someone. I did go and see someone who had an understanding of trauma, because what she did was sit beside me through that journey, bore witness to what I'd experienced. She was empathetic, she was supportive, she understood trauma, she let things unfold at their own pace. I won't go into all the details. I'm sure everyone has their own lived experience. But what did become apparent in therapy was that I had no memory for just about 10 years of my childhood, and I didn't know the significance of traumatic amnesia. So great was my medical training. Had no idea. Of course, my therapist knew, but didn't let on. Again, that unfolded. I'd always known that I couldn't reminisce as other people did. I used to get very irate when my friends would talk about, who the grade 5 teacher was or where they sat in class. I couldn't even remember being in school, And I'd always used the line my mother had told me, but I had a happy childhood. But if anyone asked, poked the boil, I'd become quite sarcastic, and I gather I removed a few heads in the process, because I was protecting. I didn't know what I was protecting, and so over time, my story unravelled, and writing my book, I suppose, did help the process of bringing all those fragments of experience back together, and the process of integration. And I'm not standing here to say that I'm done. Everyone's a work in progress, I believe. But I do feel that having the support of someone who listened and heard and understood did help me make meaning out of my life, and see that trauma was a part of me, and help me to move on. And be able to stand up here, because for me, I'd been silenced speaking socially, let alone speaking in public. So that's been, really an enormous part of the process for me. So, also very technically challenged, so just bear with me. Seems to have worked. So more than 2 million people who've experienced all sorts of trauma. So we estimate 4 out of every 25 adults. Trauma's part of the human condition. You can't go through life without experiencing some form of trauma. And it all invokes horror, fear, helplessness, and can overwhelm us. But what we know is that childhood trauma tends to have much more profound impacts, because it occurs during those crucial developmental years. And it's often repeated. And we know also that the majority of consumers presenting to services who have trauma at the basis of their issues, and that's often the majority of consumers presenting to services, have experienced multiple unresolved and often unacknowledged childhood traumas. So I'm talking today about trauma which is called complex trauma, and I was at a seminar last week at Westmead Hospital where there was a group of psychiatrists deciding on what the best title would be for this, and it was a great exercise in semantics, there were some wonderful people there as well who did talk about how they listen to their patients and how they engage with their patients, but there was quite a diversity in the room. But for the moment we'll call it complex trauma. And the thing about complex trauma is that it's interpersonal, which means that it's perpetrated by one human being on another. And in childhood, that's often by the very person that's meant to look after the child. And so that's a very primary betrayal. It's often premeditated, it's often planned, violating, and for that reason, obviously, it has, can potentially have major effects. And I'm not here to say that, you know, everyone who's experienced childhood trauma, you know, will end up with major mental health issues. Many people are resilient, but, you know, people's resilience depends on the ages of the trauma, whether there are other people around to support and listen, and a whole range of factors. And people's responses to trauma are their own, and they vary enormously, and they're definitely not to be judged. So, are we up to the right slide? This is to keep you awake to see if I'm talking about the thing that's on the slide. So I think I've already said some of this. Thanks. So interpersonal trauma is sadly very prevalent in our society. It can be a one-off event, single incident occurring as an adult, a sexual assault, a domestic violence situation, and not to say that they aren't significant. But what our health system has tended to do is characterise all trauma in terms of single incident trauma with a diagnosis of PTSD and respond accordingly, and for cumulative, compounded, complex trauma, that's often very inadequate. So the sort of trauma I'm talking about, you know, it's up there, all forms of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional. Growing up in a family that's violent and unsafe, repeated abandonments, loss. You know, sadly, there are lots of possibilities. Series of traumatic events perpetrated by those who sit in positions of trust. Sadly, often family members in homes, sporting facilities, institutions, teachers. The number of people who are strangers is estimated at less than 4%. In fact, the survey we did on our 1300 line put it at about 1.5%. And obviously, when you've been traumatised, when your brain's growing and developing, it has potentially can affect the growth, structure and development of the brain. Studies show that those impacts can continue right through the life cycle. But you know, the good news, and I'll say more about this later, is that those changes can be reversed as well. So there's actually really good research now, which gives a much more positive message about the way, you know, people can make meaning of what's happened to them and move on with their lives in a very positive, constructive way. So I'm not here to depress everybody. Obviously, childhood trauma also affects attachment with your primary caregivers. So very important for a child, obviously, to have an attuned caregiver, someone who can reflect back, validate their feelings and emotions. In my own personal process, it wasn't until I was about 45 that I really knew that I was, you know, able to have my own feelings and beliefs and could actually identify what I wanted. I still grapple with it, mind you, but I mean, it sounds, yeah, it's quite an incredible concept that you don't actually know what your own feelings are, or that you can have them, or that you can name them. So, impacts of childhood trauma, obviously growing up in a situation of fear, that primary betrayal, tend to carry that into adult life, adolescent adult life. Potentially affects someone's sense of themselves, self-esteem, sense of self-worth, your relationship with yourself, your relationship with others, with the world, ability to regulate your emotions, to manage stress, to self-soothe. I still struggle with self-care, you know, to really look after myself as other people do. As I say, a work in progress.